There are artists who spend their careers carefully managing every relationship in the industry, who shake hands with everyone and burn no bridges because they understand that Nashville is a small town and the wrong enemy can cost you everything. And then there was Toby Keith, the big-voiced, broad-shouldered Oklahoma boy who seemed almost constitutionally incapable of holding back what he thought about anyone or anything, especially when he believed he had been wronged. By the time stomach cancer took him at the age of 62 in the early weeks of Toby Keith had left behind more than 25 million albums sold, a string of records that shaped the sound of modern American country music, and a trail of confrontations that were as much a part of his legacy as any platinum record hanging on his wall. The man who wrote Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue in 20 minutes on the back of a fantasy football sheet was not the kind of person who kept his opinions quietly tucked away out of politeness. He was direct, he was loud, and he believed in speaking the truth as he saw it even when the truth was uncomfortable or when it sparked exactly the kind of controversy that most artists spend their careers trying to avoid. His personality was not a performance or a brand strategy. It was simply who he was, shaped by growing up in Moore, Oklahoma, working oil fields by day and playing roadhouses by night, learning the kind of blunt honesty that comes from places where people don't have time for pretense. After his death, as the tributes and remembrances poured in from across country music and from the military communities he had served through over 200 USO shows in Iraq and Afghanistan, something else also resurfaced. The rivalries, the confrontations, and the names he carried with him right up until the end. These were not manufactured dramas invented for television. They were real conflicts rooted in real disagreement, and they reveal a man who was as passionate in his dislikes as he was in his loyalties. Understanding who Toby Keith butted heads with, and why, tells you more about who he actually was than any of his radio hits ever could. The first name on that list, and the one that echoed loudest through the halls of country music, was Natalie Maines of the Dixie Chicks, later known simply as the Chicks. The roots of that conflict go back to a song that Keith wrote not as a commercial calculation but as a genuine personal act of grief and anger. His father, Hubert Koval Jr., an Army veteran who had served in Korea and lost an eye in service to his country, was killed in a car accident in the spring. His father had begged him for years to go play shows for troops overseas through the USO. Keith had always been too busy, running a schedule of over 130 shows a year. After his father died, he promised himself he would finally go. Then September 11th happened 6 months later and everything changed. Within weeks, Keith sat down with nothing more than a fantasy football stat sheet and wrote what would become one of the most divisive songs in the history of country music. He originally called it The Angry American. The label asked him to remove that title because the phrase never actually appeared in the lyrics. The anger, however, remained in every line. Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue reached the top of the country charts and became the defining anthem of a post-September 11 America that wanted to hear someone say exactly what Keith was saying without apology or qualification. It also made him the loudest lightning rod Nashville had produced in years. And one of the first people to publicly fire at him was Natalie Maines. Speaking to the Los Angeles Daily News in the summer she made her feelings about the song unmistakably clear, calling it ignorant and saying it made country music sound ignorant too. She took specific aim at the line about putting a boot in the enemy's backside, suggesting that anyone could write something that crude. Keith did not take this quietly. He responded through CMT, dismissing her criticism with the blunt observation that since she didn't write her own songs, her opinion on his songwriting carried very little weight with him. The feud then moved from words to something more visual and far more pointed. At his concerts, Keith began displaying a doctored image behind him that placed Maines alongside Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. The image was designed to suggest her criticism of American military aggression was essentially taking the side of the enemy. It was a brutal move and one that Keith himself would later admit crossed a line. The conflict reached its most public moment at the Academy of Country Music Awards in the spring of both Keith and the Dixie Chicks were nominated for Entertainer of the Year. Keith won. Maines showed up wearing a shirt with the letters FUTK on the front. Her spokesperson claimed it stood for Friends United in Truth and Kindness. Almost nobody believed that explanation. The host of the evening, Vince Gill, openly interpreted the acronym exactly the way most people in that room did. The message was loud and clear even if the official statement tried to deny it. By the summer however, something had shifted inside Keith. A close friend had just lost a young daughter to cancer. Faced with that kind of real and devastating grief, Keith looked at the magazine cover sitting on a table in front of him, the one showing his face and Maine's face side by side under the headline Fight to the Death, and felt the absurdity of the whole thing hit him. He later told the press that he said enough is enough to himself in that moment. He publicly stated that he was done with the feud because he had realized there were far more important things to concentrate on than maintaining a rivalry with another entertainer. But he was careful to hold his ground on the substance of it. He told reporters that he had never once publicly attacked another artist for their creative choices, and he felt that Maines had done exactly that to him when she went after his song. He had never started the fight, he insisted. They had come after him first. 2 months later, in an interview with CMT, he added something more personal. He said he was embarrassed by how far things had gone on his end, specifically the image he had shown at concerts. He described it as going a little over the top. He said he was not that mean. And in a moment of almost reluctant honesty, he acknowledged that by the time he had stepped back from the feud, Maines was already getting so much heat from so many other directions that his silence would change very little. She would have the same thing she got without me even saying a word, he said. That sentence contains both a degree of self-awareness and a trace of satisfaction that he never quite tried to hide. The second name on the list brought Keith into conflict with a man who stood for everything his post-September 11 brand was explicitly pushing against. That man was Peter Jennings, the anchor and managing editor of ABC World News Tonight, one of the most respected broadcast journalists of his generation. Shortly after Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue became a phenomenon, ABC was planning a televised patriotic special. Keith was invited to perform. The network, operating under the editorial guidance of Jennings, asked him either to tone down the lyrics of the song or to choose something else to perform. Keith refused both options entirely. He did not tone down the lyrics and he did not pick a different song. Instead, he walked away from the appearance altogether, declining to participate in the special at all. His public comments about Jennings were sharp and pointed. He described the anchor as completely out of touch with working-class Americans and suggested that someone sitting in a Manhattan newsroom had no business deciding what a song about grief, patriotism, and military honor was permitted to say. This was not a polished media response carefully reviewed by a publicist. It was exactly the kind of response that had always defined him. He believed the song was right and honest, and he would not water it down for anyone, not even to appear on a national television special that would have given his work an enormous platform. The clash with Jennings was a microcosm of a larger tension that ran through Keith's entire career. He had no patience for what he saw as coastal elites who used their positions in media to decide what was acceptable for an audience they didn't understand and had never lived among. He had grown up in a world where people said what they meant and meant what they said, and he carried that instinct into every public confrontation he ever had. The third name was Kris Kristofferson, and the story surrounding this particular clash is one of the most famous and disputed episodes in the history of modern country music. In the spring of actor Ethan Hawke published a piece in Rolling Stone that described a backstage confrontation at Willie Nelson's 70th birthday concert held at the Beacon Theater in New York. According to Hawke's account, Toby Keith arrived at the event, which was packed with musical royalty including Norah Jones, Paul Simon, and Elvis Costello, and made his way toward Nelson to offer birthday wishes. As he passed Kristofferson, a man who had served as an Army Ranger, a commercial pilot, and then became one of the most celebrated songwriters in American music history, Keith allegedly muttered a warning about not wanting any left-wing content performed that night. Kristofferson, according to Hawke's telling, fired back immediately and with considerable force, demanding to know if Keith had ever worn his country's uniform and challenging his right to wave the flag while making the financial benefits of that association without having made the military sacrifice it represented. The account as Hawke told it became one of the great country music confrontation stories. It had political weight, personal stakes, and two enormous personalities in direct opposition. The trouble is that neither of the two men at the center of it confirmed the story. Toby Keith came out at the ACM Awards shortly after the article appeared and called it a fictitious lying thing. He questioned why Hawke had gone to such lengths to describe the incident without using his name directly, suggesting it was an attempt to avoid the consequences of making such a pointed accusation. Kristofferson's response was more complicated. He initially said the story was nonsense, but later admitted, somewhat ruefully, that he genuinely could not remember whether it had happened or not, noting that it supposedly took place 6 years before the article appeared and he had difficulty even recalling what he had eaten for breakfast. His wife, however, was said to remember it clearly. Kristofferson eventually tried to dial back the tension entirely, saying he was on good terms with both Keith and Hawke, and even thanked Hawke for what he called a colorful recollection. The story sits in that peculiar space where the truth is genuinely uncertain, but the underlying conflict it points to was completely real. Keith and Christofferson represented two fundamentally different ideas about what patriotism meant and what country music's relationship to American military and political power should look like. Whether or not specific words were exchanged in a dark backstage corridor in 2003, the tension those words supposedly captured was not invented. And then there was the fourth and perhaps most layered relationship on the list, because this one never became a war and eventually grew into something closer to genuine mutual admiration. That relationship was with Merle Haggard. Haggard was the artist that Toby Keith revered above almost all others in country music. He was the Bakersfield sound made human, a man who had done real time in San Quentin and come out the other side to write some of the most honest and enduring songs in American music history. Keith covered Haggard's songs in his live sets regularly and spoke of him in interviews with something that approached reverence. Which is exactly what made it painful when Haggard publicly criticized the direction of Keith's music during the early years of the Iraq War era. As Keith was riding the enormous wave of post-September 11 patriotic sentiment with his music, Haggard voiced his discomfort with the chest-pounding character of some of those songs, describing the tone as a cheer for war rather than a tribute to the people fighting it. Haggard himself had a complicated history with politically charged music, having written Fighting Side of Me and Okie from Muskogee Inn, songs that positioned him as a defender of traditional America against the counterculture. But in the years since, he had come to have mixed feelings about what those songs had represented and how they had been used. He was in a different place politically, and what he saw in Keith's music bothered him. For Keith, criticism from Haggard was not the same as criticism from Natalie Maines or Peter Jennings. This was not an ideological opponent or a media gatekeeper. This was the man he had modeled part of his own artistic identity on. The criticism landed differently. Keith was initially defensive, as he tended to be when challenged. But he did not go to war with Haggard the way he did with Maines. He gave the legend room and time. And in the years that followed, the relationship healed itself. By the middle of the decade, Haggard was publicly praising Keith's songwriting ability, and the two men shared stages and mutual respect in a way that suggested the earlier friction had been processed and set aside by both of them. The fullest expression of what their relationship had become arrived in the final weeks of Haggard's life. Early Haggard was playing a show at the Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas, and he was in bad shape. He needed to be in a hospital, but the bills for his band and crew had to be paid, so he went on anyway. Keith, who happened to be in Las Vegas and got word that Haggard was struggling, showed up at the venue. According to the account shared by actor W. Earl Brown, who was present that night, Haggard turned to Keith and asked how many of his songs Keith knew. The answer was a lot. Keith walked Haggard onto that stage, stood by in the wings, and told him he would be there whenever he needed, and after Haggard made it through about 8 songs, Haggard called Keith up and together they finished the set. Brown later wrote that nobody should ever speak ill of Toby Keith to him, because thanks to Keith, Merle Haggard left that stage with his dignity intact. Haggard passed away just a few weeks later on his 79th birthday. That story, more than almost anything else in Toby Keith's long public life, reveals the man beneath the bravado. He was loyal. He was willing to set aside whatever friction had existed and do what needed to be done for someone he genuinely admired. When Haggard needed somebody that night, Keith did not send a message or offer a public tribute. He showed up. Toby Keith was a complex man whose public persona, all flag-waving muscle and unfiltered opinion, was real but incomplete. He voted for Bill Clinton. He also voted for George W. Bush. He was a registered Democrat for most of his adult life who re-registered as an independent because he felt his own party had abandoned the values of working-class Americans who supported the military. He performed at Trump's inauguration not as a political endorsement but because, as he told The Atlantic, when the President of the United States asks and you're able to go, you go. He had also performed for Barack Obama and for George W. Bush and had completed over 200 shows for troops deployed overseas in active conflict zones. His patriotism was not partisan. It was personal. It was rooted in his father, in an Army veteran who lost an eye in Korea and spent years begging his son to go play for the troops, and in a grief that hit Keith hard when that father was killed and was still fresh and raw when the towers fell 6 months later. He left this world having fought the same way he had always lived, without backing down and without pretending to be something he was not. He did his last full concert performance at Park MGM in Las Vegas at the end of more than a year after announcing his cancer diagnosis. He had told fans he would see them sooner rather than later after his treatment began. He meant it and he followed through. A few weeks later, he was gone. The Country Music Association announced his posthumous induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame, cementing a legacy that was already beyond argument. The names he carried through his career, Natalie Maines, Peter Jennings, Chris Christopherson, Merle Haggard, each one tells a story not just about a feud or a rivalry but about what Toby Keith believed in and what he was willing to fight for. He believed in honesty. He believed in loyalty to the people who serve.